My guest is David Starkey, distinguished English professor of history, and also a figure who has played a considerable part in controversy in public life, on the radio, in the BBC's programme The Moral Maze, and more generally in public debate. And our conversation today is about his lifetimes and opinions. Simple as that. David, welcome. Thank you for coming. Let me just begin by asking about where you came from, because I think our origins are not very different. We were born and brought up in the northwest of England, and in your case, in Kendal. In my case, in a suburb of Liverpool. So, what was it like growing up in the 1940s, 50s?
In the 1940s and 50s there. Well, I think I can best explain it by saying just how keen I was to escape. I still remember my first journey to Cambridge, where I went to university, my mother tearful on the platform of Kendal railway station, and me doing my best to appear deeply anxious and sort of reluctant to be leaving home. The moment I got in the train pulled out. I did my obligatory wave, and then I thought, I've escaped. Now, that presents much too simple a picture. I was profoundly conditioned and shaped by that. I believe very much in the importance of roots, but in the sense of the roots of a plant. They are where you start. They're not where you finish. This whole absurd notion of authenticity, that we should never change from what we were, seems to me to be the absolute opposite of human development. So now let me start and try to answer your question, which was, I was born in Kendal in January 1945. My parents were not native. They had come from very near to Liverpool. The other end of Liverpool's great creation, of course, is the 18th century. It's a great port and flourishing even more in the 19th century and the early 20th with the Atlantic trade. At the other end of the Mersey Canal is Manchester. And my parents came from Manchester. Manchester was the cotton capital, and the actual capital of cotton spinning was where my parents came from, Oldham and Rochdale. And they were a product of that world of intense industrialization. They were the laboring poor. My parents were, if you look at them sociologically, they were identical. If you actually look at them in terms of family experience, they were about as different as it's possible to be. My mother's family was close-knit, was loving, was wholly supportive. She had, for her time and her class, the most liberal of upbringing. She looked back on it with unadulterated delight. My father's was a horror. He lost his mother when he was an infant, his father when he was 11. They were in the profoundest poverty. There was another daughter who was barely 11 months. My father and his stepmother and this daughter and a sickly elder daughter. And my father, at age 11, was effectively the principal breadwinner. Just leave school half-time at 11 to be a barber's boy. And this world, so I have that as an inheritance. But the thing that shaped me, and in other words, people would say absolute working class, the thing that transformed me was their religious affiliation. When I look at the exchange of letters between my father and his stepmother at the time of his marriage to my mother, it's like something out of the Old Testament. They are letters written in a biblical language, asking for permission to marry, for a blessing and whatever. And the thing that shaped more than anything else my family experience was the fact that my parents were members of the Society of Friends, a small, obscure religious denomination which worked in Oldham on two very different levels. There were the cotton mill owners and managers and whatever who formed the bulk of the meeting. And then there was a group that really was around the Sunday school that were the workers in either as the women were cotton weavers, the men were engineers or actual cotton spinners. And what that did, it gave me, in many ways, a middle class upbringing. It meant there were books. It meant we had an ordered family life. It meant there was religious observance. It meant, above all, education was taken with intense seriousness. And this is the key to me.
As a matter of your description of the English working class, the Northern English working class, accords very much with my own and my family background.
You even shortened your A. you suddenly said class.
Well, that's perfectly true. I mean, and
teasing you a little, yeah.
No, that's fine. But I was thinking my mother and my grandmother both left school at 14. They were, however, familiar with Italian opera. They read serious books. My father was from Dublin, and he left school at 14. Again, fairly hard beginning to his life, namely that he was the cabin boy on the ship that supplied all the lighthouses around Ireland. And for the first 2 years of that job, he was sick every day. He took him a long time to get over seasickness. So people had hard lives, but they were better educated, I think, than many people are graduating from university today.
Absolutely.
And of course, they're not all the same, as you already pointed out. My parents were Catholic. That was one important element of the way of life. But of course, they were born into a background. In my mother's case, it was a background in which her father had been in the British Army. He'd ended up as a colour sergeant, so obviously a man of some ability. NCO in the pre-First World War British Army would be a man of some capacity. He then went to run a pub in the Dock Road in Liverpool. It was famous because it served a very good meal, which cooked by my grandmother for all the dockers. And on the one occasion when, this is family law, when my grandmother remembers bad language being used, the man who used it, a newcomer, was taken outside and it was explained to him this was not done. And he came back in and apologized. Now that's a group of horny-handed working men, dockers, who probably swore freely among themselves, but never in front of ladies. So there was quite strong
rules. But again, it's very interesting to make this point of discrimination and difference. The characteristic of my upbringing was absolute teetotalism. Alcohol was what had destroyed my father's family. On one occasion, my mother said to me quite bluntly, "You know your father's father was a drunk." And then I found a photograph which proved it. Here was this kind of bizarre little Charlie Chaplin figure between these two strapping sons going off to Gallipoli. And so there was the teetotalism. The other source of difference, and what we haven't really touched on, and this is very much about politics, I was brought up in a family, my parents and my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, lived with us for the first 4 or 5 years of my life, which was as divided politically as it could be. This parody of the working class as all hardline left. So there was my father, who was indeed, but not my father was a sort in modern politics. He would have been a Corbynista, except, of course, this is the 1930s. This is the world of an extraordinary belief in international peace, in international justice, of serious opposition to Islam. In other words, he was an absolute devoted to George Lansbury as leader of the Labour Party. He's a passionate reader of the Manchester Guardian. I have all the clippings that he actually took from it. My grandfather, who lived with us on the other hand, was one of those who voted for Churchill in Oldham when he first stood for Parliament in, I think, 1900. And he was such a serious working class Tory. He was so absolutely patriotic. This thing that is the key element of the Disraelian coalition of the working class Tory with the south of England was patriotism. And my grandfather was passionately patriotic, to the extent that although he was in his 30s, he had 3 children. He volunteered in the First World War. And my mother was a liberal. So I was all, you were talking about controversy and whatever, I was brought up with it. Yes. I was brought up with the vigor of debate and interchange and whatever within the family.
Well, the same it's true in a different way, I think, in my case. But because in Liverpool, there was a very, very strong conservative working class movement. But the clubs were called the Protestant Conservative Working Men's Association. And the rule more or less was, if you were a Catholic, you were Labour. If you were a Protestant, you were Tory. And that particular division has disappeared. My first job in journalism was interviewing the leader of the Protestant Party in 1966 in the Liverpool Council, when he had 6 other people in it, and that's gone. But the sectarian divisions were as important in those days, I think, as they were later in Belfast. Let me ask you now about school, because normally people who are telling the kind of story you're telling about their lives, school and particular teachers played a big part in it. Is that true for you?
Yes, it is. I mean, I think particularly my primary school, I had totally different types of experience in my primary school from my grammar school. In my primary school, but you can get an idea of how extraordinarily liberated it was. I still have 3 volumes, and we'll bring this back to Liverpool in a moment. I still have 3 of the 4 volumes of the Quinnell's History of Everyday Things in England, which are inscribed in 1956 to David Starkey for the prize in Environmental Studies in 1950, expletive deleted, 6. So you can tell what sort of school. It had a very heavy Quaker influence. It was totally female dominated. It was progressive in every single sense of the word you can think. My grammar school, although it had been subject, again, to somebody to whom I owe an enormous debt. The first headmaster I had there was a man called James Boyes. He went on and finished up as the head of City of London. And if it hadn't been for an unfortunate tendency, I think, towards both alcohol and the ladies, would probably have gone further. But he was, at the time, he was the youngest head in the country. He was about 32. And he was a reforming headmaster. And he'd taken a traditional boys' grammar school and humanized it. He'd effectively, we're talking about 56, he'd effectively abolished corporal punishment. I mean, it happened, but only the most egregious cases. But it was still an all-boys school with I think, an entirely male staff. So my experience of upbringing was really, if I can now shift gear violently, it's a bit like Edward VI, who describes himself, the son of Henry VIII, who describes himself as having been brought up among the women until he was 6, and then, as it were, moving into a masculine world. My move was much delayed till 11, but it was equally violent in its impact. And my first 2 years at school, I found it very difficult to settle in. I had what was known as, I think then called nervous breakdown, God knows, whatever it was. I had to take several months off, and it was assumed, of course, I'd just drift down and whatever. And instead I came back and discovered my strength, my academic strength. And the school, my primary school, again, it gave me all sorts of confidences. But the confidences were not only within the school, they were, and again, I think it's very important to get this in place, I had a series of extraordinarily powerful women who shaped me. Some within the school, Elsie Kleiman, the headmistress, but also the woman, we haven't talked about the other conditioning factor of my youth, which was that I was born quite severely disabled with club feet, and I had polio, and it was all corrected with impressively radical surgery at age 4. But of course, I was then, because there's no such thing as pinning, and virtually every bone in my lower left leg had been divided and reset to make it grow to the correct length. I was in plaster for months. And the person who rescued me was the nurse Middleton, Sister Middleton. I can still remember her in a tight blue, rather like Hattie Jakes, but much better looking, with the tight belt and whatever. But she did things that were inconceivable, of course. They knew I had to be in a plaster for months. Nobody had thought how I could move. She went out and begged and borrowed bits of a car tire, a punch, some leather laces, and some leatherette, and made me a boot. Can you imagine? Yes. Can you imagine? And then there were other figures like that. There was the physiotherapist. There was the woman who was in charge of radiography. She I had a nasty carbuncle. It was treated with infrared. No idea whether it did anything, but the idea was to avoid lancing it and leaving me with a huge scar. But we had these most extraordinary conversations. And at the end of it, she gave me a volume, which I still have, called 100 Great Lives, and said, "You will be one of them."
Now, do you just think about that? Yes, sorry.
Just think about that. So these, you see, again, we've all persuaded ourselves that women have not had a role. This is complete nonsense. The thing that characterized all of them was, of course, they were unmarried.
Yes.
And they were devoted and they were wedded to their jobs, to their position. Many of them were undoubtedly lesbians by today's standards. I look at my doctors, and one of them was a figure purely out of the well of loneliness. Elizabeth Kemp, the hair parted in the middle in a page boy cut, collar and tie, shoulders covered in dandruff, 999 denier stockings, and brogues, with inch-thick soles, and that sort of manliness, but wonderful and vibrant, vigorous. So I was dealing with people like that to an extraordinary extent at a level of quasi-equality. And then my grammar school, okay, it gave me a very good basic education. But the things that have contributed most to what I am was the school's tradition in public speaking on the one hand and in acting on the other. I was right from the beginning. This may surprise you, it may not surprise you. I was the star public speaker. The only time I was ever popular in the school, because we had a house system, was when there was the elocution competition. I invariably won it. And it also had something really valuable for what we are doing now. You've got a script. I never need one, for the simple reason, as a teenager, I was put through the routine of stump speaking. In other words, you are required to perform with no notice on a topic. And I can still remember going up to the steps with my history master, George Zare. If you remember Dan Dare, he was always known, the pilot of the future. He was always known as Zanzare, pilot of the past, with kind of Andrew Neil Brillo pad hair, and with a leery smile on his face as he gave you the little folded slip of paper. And it could be anything. These are the 50s. From French cinema to should Britain join the European Economic Community, or whatever it was called in those days. And you just had to talk. 2 minutes if you were junior, 3 if you were middle, and up to 5 if you were senior.
There are extraordinary parallels in our lives.
I noticed this. Yes.
Because, like you, the first school I went to, the elementary school, was again dominated by women. And furthermore, they didn't just teach us English, maths, and so on. They were very keen on teaching us manners. They wanted us to show our hands, so we cleaned our nails every morning. There was an emphasis on good behavior, which, subsequently Marxists have said it was middle-class behavior. But in fact, it was simply good behavior, and it enabled people to get on in the world. Like you, but much less seriously, I was ill and away from school for a year with tuberculosis. That absolutely transformed my life because I read. I really became devoted to reading, and then it gave me a lot of help. And then when I returned to school, I found myself obviously able to compete because of my passion for reading, but also not particularly popular boy. The thing which made me popular was one day I was told to give a speech, and I discovered on the hoof that I could give one. And as you say, to be able to do that was the thing I became known for in the class.
What about acting? Did you act?
I did act, and I wanted to be an actor, and I did various exams for it, and I got silver medals and things. But frankly,
never gold.
No, never gold. That's good. And that told me that I would never be a good actor, really. I might be okay to be a supporting actor in an amateur dramatic club and so on, but I knew it was...
You were spear character.
It was over for me,
carrier,
that's
yes.
right. So I gave that up. And I'm sorry I didn't devote myself more to the theatre, not as an actor, but maybe learning to be a playwright or something. That was something I had an alternative career. But anyway... There's another element in our lives too. Namely, in my case, I was born in 1942. The war was still on. You were born at the end of the war. My first memory is of the street party on VE Day.
Yeah, you see, I slept through VE Day. My mother said I was the only person in Kendal who slept solidly through solidly through VE Day.
Well, if you had been at the party in your street, you would have misremembered it, because I remembered it as the table groaning with cakes and all good things. But of course, they only had an egg a month, so I was exaggerating. But didn't it? Are you in any way, do you think, shaped by the fact that you grew up in the aftermath of the Second World War?
Only insofar, well, in two ways. One was my father's embarrassment, that's a very mild word, that he hadn't been a conscientious objector. He had been unemployed terribly for 4 years. He had struggled with poverty, as I was describing, in his teenage and early 20s. And he got that job in Kendal, which is why they moved up from Oldham to Kendal, whereas we were saying I was born in 1935. And only 4 years later, there comes war. And of course, he was working in a factory that made commercial washing machines, which was with very, very elaborate lathes and whatever. They were immediately turned over to munitions. And therefore, he found himself making weapons of war. And as a serious Quaker, he found this a torment of conscience. And I never really knew my father as a child. And I think his withdrawnness was powerfully conditioned by that. It also, again, was the very different experience I had with my grandfather. If my grandfather had lived beyond the age he did, the late 60s, he died when I was 4, my upbringing would have been radically different. He was more prepared to intervene. I remember there was one extraordinary moment when I'd just been bought a new tricycle. This is age 3. And there was a boy living on the same council estate who was a bit of a bully and always sort of tried to knock me off it because this was a nice, privileged thing to do. And I went home and bawled. And this happened 2 or 3 times. And my grandfather then did, in a fashion which he didn't usually do, he intervened. He said, "Go and hit him back." And I did. And I have to confess, John, I've never enjoyed myself so much in my life. I discovered I was quite good at it. And I should say, I'm ashamed to say it, but I'm not remotely. I had to be pulled off him. Now, I think, you see, if it had been my grandfather to give me that kind of nudge from that point onwards, I think my peculiarity, my oddness, my distance, my hatred of sport would have all been very, very heavily modified. So that was removed by his death. And there, the other side of the story was, of course, in the background of so many of my teachers, there was wartime experience. Some of them had good wars, some of them had terrible wars. My history master, who was a man of very high talent, but a failed Don, and had apparently a terrible war. And he again was rather like my father. He could never give of himself. But he did one extraordinary thing, because I think of the wartime experiences. But he did one very, very extraordinary thing for me, which was, as a sixth former, he gave me the run of his library. A Don's library. Can you imagine? By the time you were talking about reading, by the time I went to Cambridge, I had read everything I needed to have read. I was bored out of my head for my first year at Cambridge. And I had this extraordinary and utterly destructive experience in the end of my first supervision. And I'm going to name her because she was such a disgrace, a woman called Helen Clover, who was at New Hall, which is now called Mary Edwards College. It was so ashamed of her behaviour and her name that it changed its name. But Helen Clover, at the end of the first supervision, said to me, "You know more about this than I do." Can you imagine at Cambridge, to a first-year undergraduate, did to be so stupid and incompetent as to do that? But anyway, I did. And I'm delighted to say I still have a witness. Chris Widows, who was my supervision partner, will actually does frequently vouch for this when he tells yet another Starkey story. The war was there as, for me, an offstage presence. Nobody that I knew well had participated in it. But the experience of being involved or equally not involved,
yes,
coloured people profoundly.
Well, again, people who came back from the war, and my father was in the Merchant Marine and went round the world. He was off Omaha Beach on D-Day +1 in a hospital ship, that kind of thing. I had uncles who would come back. People were very different in their accounts. Some brought you souvenirs of the front, and most improper weapons they would give to children as what they'd brought back, and others would not say anything, and they remained just quiet about it. And
stories of horrors.
Yes, and in case of my father, we did learn about what had happened, but years later and in dribs and drabs. And he didn't suffer anything terrible. In fact, he was very lucky. But nonetheless, obviously, it had been an experience which he didn't really want to transmit to his wife and children. So that's now let's go back for a second. The fact that you arrived at Cambridge over-prepared, so to speak. Now you were doing your topic was history. What in history had you particularly, so to speak, imbibed and mastered at grammar school?
We did the standard British, English, and European history. And I had read a lot of the Tudors, which of course became my special interest. But at that time, I was much more interested in French history. I was much more interested in European history. One of the reasons for that was we were talking about powerful women in my life. One of them was a woman called Mary Hartley, a member of the Quaker meeting. She'd been the former headmistress, I can't remember which one of the major Quaker schools in Yorkshire. And she took upon herself to rescue me from my mother, from the dominant force, because powerful mother, with in many ways very withdrawn father. And she decided that I needed to escape from my mother, so she organized scholarships for me that took me, in those days, I don't know whether you did a scholarship exam or not, but in those days, if you were going to Oxbridge Entry and you were regarded as being talented, you did a third year sixth. You actually went up to Oxford or Cambridge, and you sat under really conditions very similar to those of a finals paper. You sat around the papers, you were in residence as a kind of quasi-student, the papers were marked astonishingly quickly, you were interviewed, and it was determined. And then, of course, that all took place in the beginning of December of that third year six. And you were then, if you were going to go to Cambridge, you were then at a loose end until the following October. And she filled it in by getting me scholarships, which took me to France, to Tours, to the Collège littéraire, to learn French and whatever, and to have that first experience away from home. So I came back from that almost bilingual in French. I'm ashamed to say the knowledge of the written language, especially in its historic forms, remained. The spoken language has deteriorated dreadfully. But I came back fascinated with that. I was interested in the Ancien Regime. I was interested in the immediate period after the fall of the Roman Empire, the beginning of Merovingian France, all that sort of stuff. So how I came to shift into the Tudors is a story which is really more political than intellectual.
Can I just intervene at this point? Because there's one question I want to ask before you shift into the Tudors. Listening to what you were saying about your own upbringing, the difficulties you faced, and how you then moved up society, and reflecting on my own very similar, different experience, I'm struck by the thought that the England of our youth was a place in which there were a lot of opportunities for people to rise in the world, and a lot of people anxious to help them to do so. I mean, everybody, half the adult population were talent spotters.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, this notion that, we suddenly moved from a world of rigid class structures in which you were sneered at because of your social background, you kept on, nothing could be more absolutely remote from my experience. As I've described these people, from Sister Middleton to the radiographer who gave me 100 great lives, to my teachers, every one of them was looking out. And if you were bright, you were, I mean, the word patronised, but they acted as your patron. Again, my school was staggeringly tolerant. It was a standard rugger-playing grammar school. I refused to play rugby. They accommodated me.
Yes.
Again, at Cambridge, particularly the man who recruited me for my college, well, it wasn't even a college then, it was Fitzwilliam House. It then acquired collegiate status whilst I was there. But Leslie Waper, I mean, he again was of a rather D.H. Lawrence background from the northeast, but he'd been to the Royal Grammar School, Newcastle. He was the head of the extramural department at Cambridge. He was in charge of army education, and he saw it his job to spot talent. And he had this amazing ability. I mean, when I was talking about the Scholl exam, I actually took it through Queen's, and I still remember my interview with Peter Mathias, who was slight for grandee. He was on the point of going off to Oxford, and he looked at me very hard when he said, very, very impressive. Then suddenly a faint, thin line came over his lips. Why do you write as you do? Too many adjectives. Too many adjectives. Oh, God. But Leslie said, and again, Leslie, my college protected me. I was not a straightforward or easy student. I mean, I discovered this will not surprise you either, John. I discovered the most terrible habits of cheating. Of course, because I'm so fluent, I very quickly did. These were the days when you read essays. I discovered, of course, I didn't need to write them. So I'd sit there and solemnly go through. And Leslie, he was wonderful. Rather than, he obviously realised, rather than, just disgraceful. There was, I remember the supervision again. Chris can testify to this. And Leslie looking at me with a rather beatific face, looking at me. David, I must say, I thought that was really the absolute first class. I was particularly impressed with the third paragraph on page 2. Would you reread it? But you're right. I encountered a single person who put me down on social grounds. It will not surprise you to know he was a wildly left fellow at Trinity, and a man of immense distinction, but an infinite social snob. And he used the difference between me and him and Trinity and Fitzwilliam to illustrate the social structure of the 16th century. I have never forgiven Peter Laslett for that. But that was the only time, once.
Yes.
And I think that what happened was that the division that we make so much of between public and private education, now between public schools and state schools, was felt infinitely less in this period because, of course, the grammar schools consciously modelled themselves on public schools. And there was this whole debatable land of the direct grant school. I mean, what we now regard as many of our best public schools, like Manchester Grammar School, King Edward VI, they were all really state schools.
I went to a direct grant grammar, a Catholic one, and And that became a public school as a result of Shirley Williams' attempt to close them all down. Yeah. So I am an ex-public schoolman, though I wasn't when I was at school. Anyway, now let me know.
Obviously, accounts for your shifting, whether it's long A's or short.
Well, quite. So now,
but you see, but again, we both did, didn't we? We both lost our accents.
Yes.
Again, I remember that was an issue even then. I was in for a thing called the Hastings Scholarship, and the local businessman interviewing me sort of quizzed me on that. And I gave the answer to him, which is the truthful answer. I was an only child. I essentially learned to speak from the home service, which in those days sounded like this.
Oh, absolutely.
And again, it was, and also, I don't know about you, did you have elocution lessons?
Well, of course, I was training to be an actor.
No, but
yeah,
but before that, you see, I had.
Well, only in
I had because I have a slight tendency to excessive sibilance. In other words, a sort of proto-lisp. I had them, but again, you were taken through it in standard English.
Yes, absolutely.
And there was the emphasis on that, and the emphasis on clarity of speech. But it was. It seems to me that it was a world which was infinitely less fussed about class. Again, I went to a deeply unfashionable college at Cambridge, but the only public school boys were rather thick. To be honest, if I look at the results of the Tripos, the final exam in history, I think out of 200 or 300, very large number of students. In those days, only about 10 or 12 of us got first. I don't think there was a single public school boy. And unless indeed a public school boy had been to Eton or to Winchester or St Paul's, they were usually quite amiable and good at rugby, but they weren't very much good at anything else.
No, well, as a matter of fact, I didn't go to Oxbridge. I went to London, and I went to London because I wanted to go
Which
to
college?
Queen Mary College. And I did classics, which had a good, small but good classics department. But I was an indifferent scholar and devoted myself to two things: politics, which led me into political journalism, and the theatre. I spent an enormous percentage of my grant on going to not to first nights, to second nights, and I saw a lot of wonderful plays. I think I must be one of the few people who practically all his experience of Bernard Shaw were actually watching the play, because there aren't so many performances of Shaw these days. But I went to a lot in the 60s and the 70s. And I'm very glad I did, because I saw some wonderful plays and some wonderful acting. And that was for me, remains one of my greatest joys. The only problem for me is that there's not much English language theatre in Budapest. It's my one criticism of the city. But anyway.
It has other advantages. Yes.
Can we switch back now into the kind of history you decided to move into? Why did you become an expert on the Tudors?
I was saying it was absolutely hardly at all to do with history. But by the time I was in my third year, the choice was pretty clear. Again, it's a question of personalities. There were two dominant figures in the history faculty. There was Jack Plum and there was Geoffrey Elton. And, of course, a specialist in the Tudors, Jack Plum, in the 18th century. Plum was already besotted with Sharma and a group round him. There was absolutely no room from outside. We would never looked at somebody from Fitzwilliam anyway. So I did Elton's special subject. And I discovered this was the first real moment which I began fully to engage with history since school. And like I think a lot of people, and certainly when I was a university teacher myself, I thought it was widely true. A lot of people go backwards at university if they've been very successful at school. You know, you're the top dog in school, you're very much the bottom dog when you get to university. It was only in my third year that I began fully to discover my talents. And it was in my special subject class, and there were two. It took there were two papers which took very different approaches. One was a standard essay paper. The other was documentary analysis. And I discovered I was really very, very good at documentary analysis. And Elton conducted the classes really like almost a graduate seminar. And there was one extraordinary moment when I was able to correct him, which he took very, very well. And at that point, I thought, well, and also, unlike you, I hadn't formed a passion at all outside the academic world. I wasn't particularly interested in politics at that point. I'd been very interested in theatre at school. It hadn't, despite all the opportunities that Cambridge offered, it didn't develop. I hadn't performed at the Union, surprisingly in retrospect, but I didn't. But suddenly I discovered something I could do really well. I got my first. I decided to do research. I decided to do it with Elton. I can still remember the extraordinary moment of what in practice was my interview. It was going to have drinks with him, and then I think we went out and had a pub. We did definitely go out and have a pub lunch to have drinks with him in his little house in Pretoria Road, just before the vast profits that he was making out of England under the Tudors enabled him to buy an academic palace. In Millington Road, on the sort of in those days the outskirts of Cambridge. And Geoffrey, who'd obviously formed a high opinion of me, settled down, and we began talking. We went over to the pub, and I committed my first profound error when I asked for a gin and tonic rather than a pint, and the look of disgust that came over his face. And then I committed my second, and in fact life-defining error, which was, he then said, well, you're bright. I remember, the business of the correction and whatever. He said, I think I've got just the subject for you. Needs your kind of hard, I think he probably said hard northern mind. You're going to work on the Exchequer. I said, Professor Elton, I'm not going to work on the Exchequer. I'm going to work on the Royal Court. At this point, he looked at me. I've demonstrated that the court is of no importance. Everything has to do with bureaucracy. This is mere flummery, flim-flam and whatever. I said, I'm sorry, I want to do it. Right, you've got a fortnight. I was set 2 weeks to prove to him that there was something in the topic that was worth doing. And this again is where life has this peculiarly circular quality. I described the awful Helen Clover. Well, she was awful in one sense, but she set me off in completely the wrong course if it came to exam success. She then said, okay, you know everything. Go and do odd things. Do the history of women. So, as an undergraduate, before the history of women ever been invented, I was writing first on Margaret Beaufort and then my second essay on Anne Boleyn. And when I did that second essay on Anne Boleyn, I read a book by Paul Friedman, a huge 2-volume thing published in the late 19th century, which completely opened up the world that you would love, the world of the high politics of the Tudor court. It was essentially composed out of the dispatches of the imperial ambassador in England, Eustache Chapuis, and it was a day-to-day account of the struggles of a court and the politics of a court. And I grasped that as an undergraduate. Of course, there was no opportunity to write about it because that wasn't fashionable history. But of course, I had up my sleeve when Elton threw me this challenge. I had up my sleeve that I had the illustration. And so what I was able to do at the end of that fortnight, I was able to show to him that it has become one of the axiom principles of the analysis of court politics, which I went on to invent, that all the men who were executed with Anne Boleyn were members of the king's most intimate private circle. They're the equivalent of the Downing Street staff who've just been fined for going to parties. And so, but I could do that. I could document it. And at which point Geoffrey said, all right, you can do it. So isn't it odd how the good and the bad, how these different aspects of one's life sort of echo and chime across time in a most...
Well, that launched you into that period of history and into a great success on that. But you subsequently leap out of purely academic history and into a public, well, I would say a career of public debate and controversy. How does that happen?
As always, by chance. Everything in my life. I mean, I've never been a planner. I've never been an organizer. I've simply taken opportunities when they've been offered. And what happens in my career is there is a series of moments. Again, you talked about the business of talent spotting, when an individual will spot you. And the thing that stepped me into television, step is far too weak a word, propelled me into television, was I was appointed at LSE in 73, and the break came only 4 years later in 77. And I taught, when I was at Cambridge, a young man, now last dead, called Charles Kitchen, who was an RAF cadet. And he wasn't terribly serious about history. He wasn't terribly serious about anything else. But when he went into the RAF, of course, as an RAF cadet, he was compelled to join the service to pay off, as it were, the scholarships which he'd received. And of course, he discovered that in the RAF, it was on the whole regarded as being undesirable if you were drunk when you were flying a plane. It was quite a good idea occasionally to go to the gym. So Charles decided instantly that the RAF wasn't for him, so he bought himself out and he joined Granada. And he was in Granada as a researcher. And his first job turned out to work for one of the key figures in both good and bad in my life, a man called John Slater, who was the founder producer of World in Action, which is one of the key shaping television programs of the post-war period in Britain. And John at that point had just left World in Action. He was still a star at Granada, and he was working with Russell Harty on a program that was to be called Behave Yourself. And if you've any memory of Russell Harty, you'll know that was all about misbehaving yourself. And Charles's brief was to find a historian. The conceit of the program, again, John Slater, most extraordinary man. It was early reality television. It took a group of people from a real-life Coronation Street in Oldham. It got them very drunk in a studio in Manchester so that they would talk about eating and sex and clothes and sex and work and sex. And to give a veil of respectability to all of this, there was a panel of experts. So there was Nick Humphrey, the animal behaviorist. There was the then head of the Museum of Mankind. There was a fashionable Harley Street psychologist. And they wanted a historian. And Kitchen's job was to find the historian. And he hummed and hawed and hummed and hawed. And finally, Slater was very, very physical. So I put him with his back, you will. And Charles said, there's nobody. And then finally John said, look, you read history at Cambridge, there's got to be somebody. And so finally, this resounding verdict was delivered on me. Oh, well, I suppose as David Starkey, he's probably the least boring. So with the accolade, the least boring historian in Cambridge, I found myself in this Charivari of 1970s television. It was the most extraordinary experience. Needless to say, again, I was probably rather camper then than I am now. And I remember John telling me that after the first recording, the executive said, oh, get rid of the man, get rid of that man. And Slater dug his heels in and didn't. And the interplay between myself and Russell, of course, who was also gay, though very much concealed about it, became the selling edge of the program. The program was far too risky to be broadcast anywhere else apart from Granada land. But we got 98% audience share. I have never been as famous in my life as in that summer of 1977 in Manchester. I could not move without people. But John, I don't know whether you ever got into that sort of world of television. It was, I've been brought up teetotal. I'd obviously ceased to be at Cambridge, but my Cambridge was pretty ascetic. Having a glass of dry sherry before dinner was regarded as, the ultimate sign of decadence and whatever. Suddenly, you're in the world. This was Harold Wilson trying to impose special profit taxes on ITV companies. You're in a world where every executive drink cupboard was open.
Yes.
I still remember the train going up. In those days, there were dining cars on the train. And there was a young man, now no longer young, but very distinguished. I've just mentioned his Christian name. But his only real function was twofold. He was called the researcher. His first job was to pick up for Russell in Manchester's then only gay nightclub, and his second job was to book the table in the dining car. But he had the job. There were only four of us. There was Russell, there was John, myself, and David. So there were just four of us. But his job was to book two tables because the table opposite was needed for the wine. This is a 2-hour journey to Manchester. It was like going into the Feast of Gargantua, and I'm afraid I was seduced. Oh, I was seduced.
Well, you went, I think, in the 70s to London to LSE.
To LSE.
I went to Fleet Street, which is just at the end, by LSE.
And in those days, it was just as I was describing Granada.
Exactly. Very alcoholic. I had a number of people, as you did, who liked what I did, liked my work, and who really essentially acted as patrons, pushing me in the right direction. There were some very names you will know, names like Colin Welsh, Perry Worsthorne, Bill Deeds, Peter Otley. And I would say, frankly, that the 70s in London, the Daily Telegraph was the best place to work in terms of having some wonderful, lively, clever, brilliant, imaginative minds who and I think that's where Thatcherism was born. I mean, you had a couple of Thatcherites, Peter Jay on the Times, for example, Tim Congdon on the FT. But in general, it was the Telegraph that was the standard bearer of Thatcherism a little bit before Thatcher, as well as during and with her. But it was, of course, an alcoholic culture. I mean, the people, I'd drunk a little before, but I'd never got into the habit of drinking 2 or 3 gin and tonics before lunch, for example, which was quite common in Fleet Street in those days. And it was, of course, an exciting time to be there. You were I was in television briefly too, but you were excited by the fact that this was an amazing new world, television. I was excited because this was an amazing new development in politics.
You were much less frivolous than I was. I was very frivolous at this point. No, let's.
I very much doubt that that's true.
No. It is no. Please, it's really important that one says these things. Although I was highly talented, I did not exploit my talent as well as I should have done as a university teacher. Because the other thing that we've left out, of course, I'm gay, and going up to London in the 70s, again, was this just completely opening world.
Yes.
Totally opening world in which I spent far too much time and energy, but it was great fun. And again, in television, I wasn't there to do anything serious. It was all an expression of, the indulgence of personality. And how I made an impact was, if you like, this explosive personality, this gift with language, this ability to both shock and entertain, and with a certain, because I'm intelligent, with a certain edge of something more substantial to it, and that's what carried me through. But again, there's another side. We talked about the positive side of patronage. It's very important that one puts the other side. All my relations, beginning with my own mother, who was absolutely the person who created me, who gave me the confidence, an absolutely untouchable and unbreakable confidence, which has carried me through all sorts of things. But she was somebody I finally had to break away from. Similarly with Geoffrey Elton. He wanted to shape, finally, what I did. And he could not. He'd allowed me, he'd given me that latitude, that first moment when I corrected him on the identification of a document, on what category of document. Was it a Sherry's circular letter, or was it a royal proclamation? He again allowed me to do the dissertation. But when it finally came to the challenge in which the results of that dissertation proved that, if you like, his life work was wrong, For years, he tried to accommodate the two positions. And then finally, as he got into his late 60s and early 70s, he reverted to it. He was really German, of course, his real name. I mean, he's one of that great, wonderful German Jewish academic diaspora, real name Gottfried Rudolf Ehrenberg. He reverted to a kind of Germanic authoritarianism, and our relationship ruptured. And ruptured horribly. Similarly, my relationship with Slater. But then what happens is a whole sequence of other people come along. It was you can actually trace a sort of lineal descent from that 1977 program. You can do a genealogy, which carries me through television. And of course, the thing that really brought me to full recognition was actually radio. It was David Coombs, who was the producer for The Moral Maze. Again, fascinating where we are now, essentially in competition with Roger Scruton. And Roger, of course, infinitely brighter than I am, but was not terribly good at the rapid formulation, the wit, at the condensed, cruel phrase. My genius on The Moral Maze, of course, purely radio, unlike the cameras which are filming this podcast. And I was good at the oral caricature. If you remember the poor pinning down of George Austen, the Archdeacon of York, after he'd been particularly rude about Prince Charles and was intolerably suffused with clerical arrogance on air. And as he was leaving the studio, my remark, doesn't his fatness, his smugness, and his pomposity make you want to vomit? But look at that triptych of words: fatness, Anglo-Saxon; smugness, Anglo-Saxon; pomposity. Yes. It's a perfect verbal caricature, and I'm now ashamed to say it formed the centerpiece of his obituary in the Times.
Oh, that's so interesting, because I was at that time a parliamentary sketch writer, and that is a theatrical critic of what's happening in the House of Commons, and humour and parody and satire are part of the recipe. And it was great fun to do, and disproportionately influential, because people read that account of Parliament rather than the full page account on page 8 or something.
The plodding nature of the proceedings.
Yes, that's right. And on one occasion, I cracked a joke about a poor Tory MP who was asking one of those questions designed to raise his credit with the minister he's questioning. And I won't repeat the joke, but the point about it is, the next day I was in the Commons, I looked down and I could see the fellow gazing sadly up at me, and I thought,
tears drifting down.
Well, I don't quite say that, but nonetheless, I thought I must try to avoid humour that is cruel, because
when were you sacked?
Well, no. I didn't think my good New Year resolution applied to the great. I applied it perfectly happily to Ted Heath and so on, but I decided I didn't really want to make fun of the humble, even though an MP is only humble in the Commons, so to speak. But there we are. But let me now take you in a different direction, because obviously this career in television and radio developed enormously, but while you also are writing. But the second thing is, your political views and opinions change.
Radically. When I was doing The Moral Maze, I had no hesitation about describing myself as a complete libertarian. And it was a stage in my own development. It carried on very naturally from the part that I'd played in the alteration of the laws governing homosexual consent in England and so on. It was also a wonderful acid to apply to virtually every public controversy, which of course The Moral Maze was all about defining. And I was told by an old colleague when I was a university examiner that Marxist students tended to do very, very well because they had an instant mode of analysis. Well, libertarianism can act as a similarly quick, radical critique of everything. And then, I suppose, is it self-doubt? Is it the fact that rather late in life I got in a long-term relationship? Is it an awareness of, we talked about this world of widening opportunities. What has been characteristic of the last dozen and arguably the last score years is a narrowing of opportunities, a shutting down. Again, we've been talking about a world where anything could be said publicly. And the more outrageously, the more vigorously, and the more flamboyantly you said it, the better off you were, the better you were paid, the more opportunities you were given. And there's been this extraordinary introversion. And the increasing seriousness of my politics, my attempt at discovering a basis for an intellectual basis for saying enough, stop, pause, rethink, started then. It's been a very, very reactive, process.
Again, could I intervene here? Would you see a comparison here between the Restoration's upsurge of sexual freedom, its upsurge in the arts and in the Restoration comedies, and then subsequently following the Puritanism period, and then of course followed by a gradual reversal to a kind of a restrained liberty in the English tradition.
Yes, well, I think you can see this process happening repeatedly. You see it in the extraordinary. The thing that is the closest parallel to where we are now is, of course, it's very important. We're here in the heart of Central Europe. It is the Lutheran Reformation, the scale of that and the speed of that. I've been writing recently, because of course I'm a specialist in this period. Luther is somebody who is totally unknown when he nails up, if indeed he does nail up, the 95 Theses in Wittenberg, which is the most unknown place on the absolute edge of nowhere. And within 4 years, he's the central figure of European history and the European political stage at that point, engaging as an equal with the Pope and the Emperor. Now, that is a degree of political change that you would find very difficult, even with today, with the internet, to rival. And the reason for it, of course, is very, very similar. It is the combination of printing with the use of the vernacular as opposed to Latin. And so what you get is an intellectual shift, which is then coupled with some dramatic media shift. And it seems to me something very much like that has happened. But equally, of course, your point about the and within 5 minutes of that, of course, you get Münster and the total abandonment of any form of law, morality, or anything else in something even more excessive than what the French Revolution did. Or you see precisely the same thing with the liberalism of the 18th century, the Enlightenment, the kind of political dress that's given to the Enlightenment by the American Revolution, then followed with the horrors of the French Revolution. And what I think, again, if I were searching for an analogy to the position of my own life, I don't believe in modest comparisons, but I would say it's Edmund Burke. That in precisely the same way that Burke, having been a radical Whig, having been an intense reformist, he's the one, with the famous motion about the influence of the king getting too great and, is increasing every day and should now be diminished, suddenly turning under the impact of the horrors. And also, not so much, only the very first taste of the horrors of the French Revolution, but with his prophetic instinct, becomes the founder of conservatism. And what I'm hoping I'm doing at the moment, and this is a very long way of getting to the point, but it's been a fascinating discussion, is that I am hoping to be able to combine my sense of history, and we haven't really talked about how my history developed on television or whatever, or through exhibitions and whatever. I became fascinated in the history of things, the history of buildings, the history of place, and that history as a kind of almost a form of transcendence, as something that isn't simply intellectual, isn't simply words, but something that touches you, penetrates you, is almost a kind of electric shock running through you. And I was using that as a presentational device. I am now increasingly convinced that this is what Burke was trying to grasp when and trying to communicate when he talked about if there is a social contract, it's a contract of past, present, and future. That it is history that is the ground. It's history that is the foundation of what we are. Again, going back again, all of these extraordinary movements of growth that then turn into luxuriance, that then turn into disaster, that then turn into a forest fire, and then something new grows from the wreck. I mean, right at the beginning of that process, and indeed the process of the invention of the English language in the late 14th century with Chaucer, you get the wonderful couplet in Chaucer's Parliament of Fowls, in which he talks about the old earth from which the new corn springs every year, just as from old books new learning comes. You see, what I think we need to be developing is and again, the traditional modern academic historian, the past is the past. It's something that we analyze carefully and coolly. We mustn't get too involved. Absolutely not. The past is the soil. It's the humus. It's this extraordinary growing organic thing from which the new comes. But what we have to do with each generation, our job, us oldies, our job is to communicate that. We are the communicators, or should be, the hyphens, the linkers of the past and the best and indeed the worst of the culture of the past to go to a new generation. That's our job.
That would be an excellent point to end, but I'm not going to, because I'm going to end by throwing out to you a number of names to get your aphoristic view of them. Historians, Thomas Babington Macaulay.
Wonderful phrase maker, and at his best, grasping utter fundamentals. I think there are the famous grandiose remarks, but there are two things. Some of his verse, Horatio at the Bridge, is the thing that I've been using as the model for analysing Zelensky. When you think of that, I mean, if you think of the moment, sorry, I'm not being aphoristic, and I apologise. But if you think of the moment of whatever the little island was concerned, where the soldiers, 3 or 4 Ukrainian soldiers, tell a Russian squadron to fuck off, that is Horatio at the bridge. Who will stand with me? The 3 men standing between Rome and its fate on a bridge. You've been seeing this repeatedly in the Ukraine. And Macaulay in that verse, although he's the least warlike of men, expresses that perfectly. And again, phrases like, nothing as ridiculous as the British public in one of its fits of morality. The thing that was intended to destroy me in the summer of 2020 was one of those fits of morality. Black Lives Matter, the COVID business, and whatever. And he punctures those.
Yes. By the way, Horatio, the bridge, is one of Pat Buchanan's favourite things to quote.
For obvious reasons. Because, but also, it gets you the full meaning of toxic masculinity. Because what we've been seeing in the Ukraine is a magnificent performance of toxic masculinity. Exactly the kind of thing that got the poor teacher sacked from Eton is what is displayed by Zelensky and his men.
And another name, a historian, Hugh Trevor Roper?
Fundamentally frivolous, I think. An affected stylist. He turns out to have been very good at very little things. He writes a rather wonderful book on Theodore de Mayerne, who is James I's physician and one of these extraordinary figures who is a kind of universal European lubricant. It's brilliant. He knows all the languages. He has the interest in the esoteric. He has the interest in the strange back passages of history, as Russell Harty accused me of being familiar with. And he does that very well. But nothing of the broader achievement of Trevor Roper survives.
Margaret Thatcher?
A phenomenon of nature. You knew her, I didn't. She converted me. again, the experience that we didn't talk about, the political experience of the 70s, because of course the 70s end in catastrophe, the end in the catastrophe of the failure of the Labour government and all the rest of it. And that was the first moment at which I first voted Tory for Margaret Thatcher. No, that's actually not true. That was my first convinced Tory vote. I voted for Heath when he was first elected, and then I'm ashamed to say, well, not ashamed to say, he was such a monster and so incompetent. I voted Liberal in the famous Who Governs Britain election. Yes. Because one thing I was absolutely certain about, I didn't want it to be Heath.
James Callaghan.
Well, indeed. I mean, Callaghan, of course, in many ways exemplified the decent Labour Party that we were talking about and that decent face of the working class. But of course, it was one that had failed, and it had failed structurally. In the same way, again, institutions go through phases. If you actually look at why the role of the Labour Party in many ways was a highly beneficial one, you of course go back to ancestral figures like Ernie Bevin, and you think of his role in the Transport and General Workers Union. That was the thing that kept the Labour Party sane in the 1930s, that got rid of Lansbury, that stopped the sort of figures that George Orwell writes about, the preposterous school teachers and whatever. But the catastrophe was in the post-war period. The trade unions themselves were taken over by this sort of nonsense. And I'm afraid Paul Callaghan acted as a kind of respectable face to the developing horror behind.
I think that Callaghan himself reached a conclusion about his own prime ministership, very, very similar to your analysis. He was the kind of respectable.
He was a
accountant.
respectable face of a horror. He was a respectable face of a horror. And again, I mean, a great deal of what Thatcher, virtually all of what Thatcher did was necessary. The way in which it was done was very often terrible. And the scars and wounds that leaves. And again, my great problem with Thatcherism is that it's not really conservatism. Thatcherism is a form of extreme Manchester School liberalism. And that it seems to me that what we have to do as conservatives now is to have genuine conservatism that is able to root liberty and the things you and I value of liberty of speech, of association, of political structures in something more stable than doctrines of rights or globalism or whatever. We've got to recognize that many of the aspects of Thatcherism were, again, another form of acid. They were dissolving social institutions, and we have to have something in their place.
I think I strongly disagree with that, but maybe we should discuss that on another occasion. Yeah. But didn't it? I think that Mrs. Thatcher's, what you're describing, it seems to me, is what I would call John Majorism or Thatcherism as on autopilot, because there was a strong dose of nationalism, patriotism in her activity. She was strongly supportive, while being personally tolerant. She was strongly supportive of what we would now say is traditional Christian morality. She was very tolerant,
these are all personal things. But the actual thrust of what she did is what I describe.
Well, I think that, for example, you're not taking account of her foreign policy, you're not taking account of the Falklands War, you're not taking account of the build-up and the rhetoric and the arguments she used in defense. But as I say...
I was talking about... I remember what I was talking about. I was talking about...
conservatism. Yeah. But you're forcing me to ask a name which I hadn't intended to, but of course you're inviting me to do this, which is Disraeli.
I think Disraeli is the proper source of conservatism. It seems to me that his romantic streak on the one hand, his extraordinary tactical brilliance, his understanding of the process of social change. I mean, look at what he says. He says liberalism is the enemy. But equally, you cannot have a conservatism which is merely stasis. You cannot have a conservatism which is simply about preserving. He says you have to have a conservatism that can adapt to, as he puts it, a progressive country. And the formula that he comes up with is you have to have change, which is in accordance with the historical tradition of the country, not derived simply from the abstract theories of liberalism as refracted through the French Enlightenment. So to clarify that point, it's the behaviour of the government that followed John Major, of the Blair government, is the precise illustration of how not to do reform. When you replace the Lord Chancellor with this notion that we can't possibly have the Lord Chancellor because it defies the separation of powers, you then wreck the protection for law taken seriously by the political establishment. When you create the Supreme Court, because again, you can't possibly have the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords acting as a Supreme Court, because again, it defies the separation of powers. You create this monster, which imagines itself as an American Supreme Court operating a non-existing Britain constitutional settlement, whereas Disraeli understands. Again, he understands the fructifying nature of history and so on. But he also he comes up with the tactical solution. He comes up with the enfranchisement of the skilled working class on exactly what you were mentioning with Thatcher, the grounds that they are patriotic. Yes. And that his conservatism is doing exactly what Johnson's conservatism isn't doing, because it finds a common language between the voters of the North and South, which is the language of patriotism. And the appreciation of our national history. And one of the things, you see, John, we've been talking too long, but it's been wonderful. One of the things that I am utterly convinced about is the history of Britain, which is really, in political terms, the history of England, offers unique solutions, because we're here in Central Europe. The astonishing contrast of our experience with theirs. This is not due to us. It's due to our ancestors. But the way in which our history contrives to reconcile the irreconcilable. Look at the statuary in London. You have a statue of James II 2 squares away from a statue of William III who overthrew him. You've Charles I at the top of Whitehall and the man who cut his head off, Oliver Cromwell, at the bottom. All these contradictions resolved. And this seems to me, we are Eliot says this wonderfully in Little Kidding, we are the descendant of the slaver and the slave, of the cavalier and of the Roundhead, of the victor and the victim. And that sort of history offers an anchor for a developing, a rapidly changing society, a multi-ethnic, not a multicultural society, but one that is both rooted and able to change, that is both inwardly sound and outwardly regarding.
I think that is the perfect place to end, if only because you are going to be addressing our final topic in a talk later this week. So. Many thanks for having here today. We have not covered in any, except for one casual reference, the fact that you were cancelled. And you have now triumphed over the cancellation, it seems to me.
Cancelled the cancellation.
Cancelled the cancellation. And I think that anybody who believes in reasoned debate, argument, and honesty in argument will have to say that you were completely unjustly and unfairly treated. And it's a great thing to see that kind of injustice reversed and defeated. And so I'd like to congratulate you on that. And of course, that's a final achievement that you can boast about. So I've enjoyed this conversation very much. Thank you for coming along. I look forward to hearing the full panoply of your argument in the talk tomorrow. And thank you again.
And thank you.